I just want to get into the space of thinking because my presentation is a little bit different from the last two. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm going to ask that, or request, if you have any questions or would like to say something, that you just, I don't know, come up here in the seat and speak with me, or you can come up front and ask your question. So I would like to thank the organizers of Sonic X Academy for asking me to present today. It's such a privilege, and I'm honored to do so. So thank you so much, Rosa, for putting this together. When I was asked to present on the relationship between theory and artistic practice, of course, this is something that interests me a lot because it's something I've been engaged with probably my whole life. But at the same time, because of this, it's very difficult to actually speak about this relationship unless you're doing so in a very particular way. Like the last two presentations, I think these are very particular instantiations of research projects with very solid research questions. And I'm afraid that what I will speak about today is not as particular, but rather quite general and quite universal in some sense, because I will speak about abstraction and listening and the erotics of abstraction. And so the context of my work is quite disparate, and I have many different identities that I work under. And there's a particular reason for doing so. The reason is to actually get into this general space of abstraction, this general space of listening and making music. So really, I'm here to speak about the love of making music in some sense, and the love of thinking with sound. And how you can actually generate a lot of philosophical trajectories for thinking and questioning reality, but through listening and through composing. So the way in which art and philosophy are entwined, it's like an open heart relationship, and it's not necessarily clear what this relationship needs to be or become, but it's in a slow transformation, so you need to have a lot of patience for this kind of work. And the work that I do is under the name Yoneda Lemma, which is not really a name, it's actually a mathematical proof by the Japanese mathematician Nobuo Yoneda. And oh, actually, I'm sorry, but I think there's supposed to be a board here to draw on. Sebastian. Great, thank you. So Yoneda Lemma is it's the sort of entity that I and Anna Mikkola performed under yesterday. It's an abstract entity, and it's useful for identifying a function in a categorical space. So this is category theory mathematics. So if you have X has a function, basically. And so you can identify spaces according to different functions and the relations. And Yoneda Lemma shows this sort of via pointing to X. Yoneda Lemma sort of shows this universal principle. It's a universal principle in a sense, or it's a proof for a universal functor to combine all these relations to see how they're interrelated. And there are many different levels of abstraction where this takes place. And other work that I do is in archaeology. So I have these different identities, and in archaeology, Actually, maybe I'll stick at the board. It's much easier. Is there an eraser? Thank you. This is just meant to be an introduction, by the way, because I will later show a video that I made for this talk, as well as read a text on the erotics of abstraction, which for me is the most naive philosophy, the sort of the most basic philosophical understanding, and it's something I've been working on this past year, this text. Thank you. And it's a kind of queer philosophy for understanding the erotics of thinking and also the erotics of life and erotics of sexual practices understood in non-normative senses. So going back to archaeology, that's the other area of work I do. The reason why I'm using archaeology as an analogy in my work is because it's a very good space for understanding abstraction, for seeing how you can actually map different relations according to levels, stratigraphic levels, using an indifference point or a datum point. So in archaeology, you'll have various different strata in a parametrized space. It looks a little bit like a piece of paper, but if you can just imagine that this is the excavation, so you've excavated downward, and then you get all these different strata, these layers, and there's a datum point that's either situated outside of this space or within it, but it's an objective position, and you utilize it to measure and map all the relations in these spaces. And so it works as a very good analogy for understanding category theory and the Yoneda Lemma, because then you can see how you have this sort of this function of gesturing, of pointing to different objects in a space in order to map relations. It's something that we do all the time in order to navigate our environment. And it's actually, again, very, very simple but non-trivial operation. And so my interest in using archaeology as an analogy and mathematics as an analogy for abstraction and for making music and understanding sound is that it's a useful way for conceptualizing space in a non-material way. So you can get into these different spaces of thinking where thought is a sort of motion, and you can map its motion according to the contingencies, the context, so this is the parametrized space, and the contingencies will be your sort of the thought's relation in its environment, so you have many different perspectives that you can go in. And this thought, which you also have to gesture to, is also outside of yourself. So it's this sort of non-correlationist understanding of thought being separate from being as a space you can think unto thought without it being it has ontological ramifications, but you can also de-ontologize in the process of thinking. So these are a little bit of the questions that I'm interested in going in. And it will come apparent, hopefully, in the text that I read, which is a little bit dense. That's why I ask if you have any questions, please ask me. Working in Yoneda Lemma, making music, and doing archaeology, I'm also a part of this collective, the xenofeminist collective, and I think that's the reason why I was asked to give a talk, because we wrote a manifesto together, Xenofeminist Manifesto, Politics for Alienation, and you can find it on laboriacuboniks.net. And this is really a platform for research, researching questions of what a feminist rationalism would be, what is the role of epistemological alienation and integrative epistemologies to form a feminist politics that is interested in going between local contexts and global understandings of reason. And it's this universalism is intersectional because it represents the forging of intersections or the slicing through of particularities. To return our focus to engineering different kinds of abstract glues through practices and to plot new relations between particularities. And each member in the group, in the collective, does different things. Some are artists, some are poets, some are researchers in gender studies, and some are musicians. And so we all have different practices, and I think that my own practice is maybe, at this stage in development, is more on the side of philosophy. And so I cannot speak for some of the things that were brought up in the manifesto today, and which is why I would prefer to speak about what I'm working on, because that is really what I think is at stake in the question which was asked to me, what is the relation between theory and practice? So I will like to play, first before the video, I would like to play a piece of music, which I think is very interesting because it highlights this tension when you are wanting to form an abstraction or an understanding of something, and you cannot. And this is actually something, or what I just said is what someone told me after they heard it. So it's a piece of music that I made with my collaborator, Donatas Tabutis, and we made this piece for an installation last week. But it brings up these questions of navigation, alienation, and abstraction. Oh. The sound is not coming through.
They're not getting anything from your laptop. Oh, media files are missing.
No, it's just this one right here.
Can you play it?
There we go.
Navigation. Navigation. There is no difference between degrees or that one. There is no difference between degrees or that. Utopia of a reason vertiginous. 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 Utopia of a reason generated light oriented meridians, generated light meridians, generated light one-way shafts of receive. Universal orientation, 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 concept spaces, magic or a potent mirror, magic or a potent mirror, magic or a potent mirror, or a potent mirror, to the global scope of nature, to the global scope of nature, to the global scope of nature, this, that, this, or 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 divine, this, or that, this, or that, this, or to the engaged, back to the engaged, back to the engaged, or this, configuration, a configuration, perspective operator, that perspective operator, perspective operator. Generated portals, generated portals, generated navigability, 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 the labor of conception, the labor of conception, the labor of conception, the labor of conception, inferential proceed, inferential proceed, inferential proceed, the agoraphobia, the agoraphobia, the agoraphobia, the agoraphobia, nothing of nature, nothing of nature, nothing of nature, nothing of nature. One-way shaft to the ceiling, 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 one-way shaft to the ceiling. Level change, level change, level change, organizations, 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 and organizations.
Load up special situations allow for the disintegration of all the forces increasing by contrast. To accompany the burst of the singularity. And voices, and voices, and voices, and
So the title of that piece is still in formation. I think that the temporary title we have is in between, but of the whole cycle of pieces is called Ear of Cyclone. And the main driving factor behind these pieces is actually this sort of vertiginous landscape within which thought is submerged. And also in the way that different memories collide into each other. So we have a kind of field of memory in which we gain certain perspectives and also lose perspective. And it's it relates to also this kind of driving desire for abstraction to understand thought itself. And that comes with philosophical thinking. So it's not necessarily the case that that will be something that interests you, but if you're a philosopher, you are interested in these questions. And I think that in order for art to really evolve, it needs to evolve in the general structure of thought, which means we must begin to situate thinking. And we should think of thought as a gesture. So now I would like to bring your attention to the Sonic Acts booklet. I don't know if you have it here, but I wrote a short text in it on listening and abstraction, and I just want to read a short passage of it before I go on to the text that I wrote for, that I've been working on, and I'll just read one paragraph, because before we go into the erotics of thinking, I just want to say a little bit about listening, because I think listening is not limited to music, or what I've been trying to demonstrate with just speaking about this last piece and showing it to you. So listening is not limited to music, just as thinking is not limited to the human. And what I'm interested in doing for future projects is doing a kind of a formalism at the level of listening, just as Xenakis did formalism at the level of composition. And we can do this now with mathematics, because mathematics is actually sort of high abstract mathematics today, in the past, say, 4 or 5 years especially, in the realm of homotopy type theory logic, is actually getting to a sort of a pre-semantic language, which can be used as an alternative programming language. And I'm very interested in the ways in which homotopy type theory logic as a programming language, and the kinds of geometries that it's proposing are potentially useful for thinking about sound in a different way, for categorizing sound, and not just sound, but also artifacts. And so these are two different separate areas, archaeology and sound, that can be brought together through this more abstract language. I cannot go into too many details right now because it's really just the beginning of this research. But the main notion relates to what I was trying to explain before about the Yoneda Lemma. But this time, it's not just the Yoneda Lemma in terms of identifying the functor, but now you have a whole series of sheaves of categorical spaces in which you can identify functors across different topological spaces through invariances. So what would be most common between these functors? So what it's presupposing is that there's a certain evolution, and these are called types in homotopy type theory. And these types having a kind of evolution, which is it's an abstract concept of a type. And in archaeology, you already use typology in order to typologize artifacts, and you typologize them over time, so you get a certain evolution of different types. But I think we can do the same for thought, and I think we can do the same for sound, if sound and thought can be understood in terms of gestures. So instead of thinking of it as an object, you must think of this as a gesture over time through different spaces. And so this could be type A, for instance. And you could have another type, type B, which would have the same sort of abstract, similar abstract dynamics, just the particularities would be distinguishable. And so that's when you can have the sort of the global to local transit, which is talked about a lot in contemporary philosophy, specifically with the work of Reza Negarestani, Fernando Zalamea, Ray Brassier, basically a lot of the philosophers who are writing for Urbanomic, which is a really highly recommended publishing company in the UK and has influenced my research a lot. Okay, so now I will read this text that I wrote. And as I said, the erotic gestures of abstraction, I think, is a very naive philosophy, a very basic, and it has a lot to do with desire and reason, and the sort of uprooting of thinking and the sort of reunification of a sort of system of ideas and concepts in order to navigate terrain differently. And the reason why I think this, even though it's quite general and almost like a pure philosophy in a sense, Platonic very much so, the reason why I think it's also relevant to feminism is because the idea is to challenge the very concepts that we understand sexuality. And that's where it becomes quite queer, because we want to challenge concepts and not hold to them. We don't want to hold to concepts of gender. We don't want to hold to concepts of sex. We need to challenge and understand concepts as something that can be morphed, because they're quite plastic. As we can see, they have contingent and continuous relations with our environment. So you can actually map concepts in the sort of diagrams that I was drawing for you. Okay, so we will watch this, if you like. And please stop me at any point if you don't understand, because I will speak a little bit about time, because time is actually what I think, the question of time is, maybe I will just pause this for a second. The question of time, I think, is at the sort of, the fundamental starting point for investigating the percept-concept bind. And of course, if you're looking at sound, that has to do with perception and also has to do with conception. So abstraction is basically necessary for understanding identities of objects that change over time. And one sort of entry point that I had before was decay, looking at decay. And that's still very much relevant because it has to do with change. And so where the mind creates a split between perception and object, it also creates the external object as an idea. And external objects resolve the problem of the changing object in perception. And this externality that is posited could be also understood as a fiction. But it's not just an object that, like you would understand a glass, but it's an object in terms of a whole space of interknitting ideas. But the abstraction is real and not a fiction insofar that it posits the necessity of our cognitive apparatus to do this. So it's also a coping mechanism to resolve the tension we have between concepts and percepts. Anyways, that was a little bit of a digression. Okay, let me start the paper. Transfiguration in erotic spaces for abstraction. So erotic gestures of abstraction is a short essay on what erotic abstraction does to thought, what philosophical stimulation or simulation does with mind mirroring itself through the sensation of thinking. And it's a seed of a much larger project merging erotic metaphysics with the archaeology of thought, wherein contextualized functions of abstract concepts and representations become artifactual datum points, the types, for navigating holes in material chains or strata of philosophical thinking and becoming in its unsparring and sensual stimulations. The American philosopher and logician Charles Sanders Peirce sought to conceptualize and frame the evolution of mind in terms of love. Erotic, which doesn't necessarily mean sexuality, it can also mean love, gestures of abstraction, launches with this important proposition. An erotic abstraction involves the love for conceptual practice, the love for abstraction, a type of philosophical thinking practice that self-consciously stimulates its domains of operational ability by exercising the erotic relationship with philosophy. An erotic relationship with philosophy puts into question what is a conceptual thinking practice in philosophy as well as art? What is the invariance that crosses both philosophy and art? How are these practices in eternal friendship? Where are they in open heart relationships with each other? An erotic relationship with philosophy puts philosophical thinking practices in a much larger conceptual project with conceptual mathematics and cybernetics, insofar as both philosophy and art are still challenged by and defined through the pragmatics of living, whose shared shortcomings in neoliberalism makes the transitioning chimeric project even more important to defend. Having an active engagement with philosophy includes the possibility for judging this engagement, challenging, via the logics of its practice, any immovable concretizations or stabilizations of philosophical hypotheses, which are, by default, already discursively overcoded. just a digression. Even though a lot of these ideas are being discussed in a certain sphere of thinkers, contemporary thinkers, and also the sort of excavation of forgotten thought, I think there's something about abstraction that, I mean, what it's supposed to do is actually get you out of discourse. And this is where I think this has a lot of potential. So the petrification of ideas can be dangerous. What is the gesture in conceptual practice and the sequences of gestures that reinforce the potential spaces and possibilities for doing different kinds of gestures in abstraction? Abstraction ought to radically open philosophy. An erotic abstraction is the self-conscious tracking of mind's envelopment in this space of thinking, so to construct non-monopathic ways out of it again and again. And thought here is understood as a material sensation constellated within intelligent systems qua streams of power that move between different niches. It's also a very general understanding of thought, so it's not necessarily limited to the human, if we want to think of this as a kind of xenophilosophy. Here, erotic is understood as encompassed by the logic of the artist of eros, or the erotic gesture, and in the sense of Diotima of Matinee's initiation of the philosopher's eros, recounted by Socrates in Plato's Symposium. Erotic refers to the force, a daemon, uniting prismatic sheaths of thought. The map encompassed proof for concepts of universal beauty. Erotic abstraction, manifesting terrifying beauty. Erotic abstraction absorbs philosophy's ontological commitments. Erotic abstraction is also a philosophical absorption in the deontological commitments of beautiful thinking. Revealing the concept of concepts of self, mind and its co-limits in the experience of abstraction. Mind, when revealed to be an existential space defined in terms of what it can do, in continuity and coherence with its variations, morphs with the force of abstraction. This abstractive morphing is an enabling condition for mind's desired self-realization as it begins to localize in the coupled feedback relation produced between the mechanics and phenomenology of abstraction. The structure of mind qua concept includes its own definition. There are a number of things that were just proposed here, and I would like to disentangle them a little bit because it's quite dense. So mind, when revealed to be an existential space, mind is a concept of concepts of self. That's what this is proposing, or what I'm proposing. Which means that you don't have one concept of self. You operate under many concepts of self. It has to do with your functions in relation to the spaces that you live in. And it's much more complex than that. But mind can be understood as this very general concept of concepts of self. And it's defined in terms of what it can do in continuity and coherence with its variations. So there has to be some kind of continuity between these different concepts of self, despite the fact that they are very contingent, or they have contingent relations with space. So this abstractive morphing is an enabling condition for mind's desired self-realization as it begins to localize in the coupled feedback relation produced between the mechanics and phenomenology of abstraction. So what is being proposed here is that first of all, abstraction is both phenomenological and there's also a certain mechanics or a grammar to it, a physical grammar. And there's a certain feedback relation between the two, just as there's a feedback relation or a bind between concept and percept. And abstractive morphing, when you can actually engage with abstraction and engage with the definition you have of mind, which is also, holding these concepts of self, you can start to construct an understanding of mind that might be different from the one you had before. So the proposition, although it's very general and naive, as I said, is to don't want to say it's a little bit like self-help because it could sound like this, but there is something about this tension that I think is extremely important. We must kind of challenge our consciousness in order to see how there is this relation between thinking and doing, and to really elevate consciousness. Oh, well, I've only gotten through the first paragraph. There's really so much material. I mean, this would take forever. I didn't say anything about temporality, but anyways, I think I will leave it at that. Because although I've shown you these diagrams, I mean, you've already sort of entered this space with me, I think. And that's all I really wanted to do. I didn't really want to read the whole thing because there's so many directions it could go through. And this is a project in process. It takes patience, just like the xenofeminist project. It's a revolution that happens processually. It happens with patience. It's not something that happens like this. And it happens on many different levels. So maybe I just leave it at that then. Thank you very much for listening.